history of the city of Baghdad, as well as the culture of learning that developed there. And hopefully it'll give you quite a bit to think about, inshallah. Although it won't be the comprehensive kind of run through that I had initially hoped I'd be able to do, but I just couldn't prepare this morning. I wasn't feeling all that great. That being said, Jazakallah khair everyone for the du'as. So what I'm going to do is I am going to share some slides. Hopefully the share function is disabled here. And hopefully that'll add a bit more richness to our presentation. Okay, so it seems to work. 1 second. So the original concept that we started with for this presentation was the culture of learning in the city of Baghdad in particular. And actually we started with the topic of Bayt al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. Now this is something you'll often hear about in discussions of the history of Islam within Baghdad, and what's known as the golden age of Islam. And this is kind of a concept that we popularize ourselves as Muslims and others popularize for us, and it goes back and forth. Although it is a deeply problematic, in a sense, concept, as I'll discuss later on. But that being said, as far as the Bayt al-Hikmah is concerned, the House of Wisdom, now what is it? What is it generally discussed as? So it's generally discussed as a metaphor, really, for this movement for the production of knowledge in 7th century, well, not really 7th century, but more 8th century, 9th century, Baghdad in particular. And historians among themselves debate what exactly this was. Some say it was a library, like a physical building that was called the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Some argue that it wasn't actually a physical place, but it was more a metaphor to describe the culture of the time, especially in the translation movement, the movement to translate knowledge from other civilizations and then develop into Arabic and then continue to develop that knowledge. So some say it's more about the movement, and it was just called Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, for the culture of Baghdad as a whole at that time. And some say that it was a particular institution, so maybe it was a library. Some say it was more of like a research institution and a knowledge developing institution, is sort of like a research university, one might say today. And others say, no, it wasn't actually an institution or a building of some sort. It was actually just a metaphorical concept to, describe like, the place. For example, like a lot of people today would refer to the city of Los Angeles as like Hollywood, right? They might just say, oh, Hollywood. That doesn't mean, there's a particular place in that city that is Hollywood, or a particular institution or organization or building or something like that. It's just the culture of the place is associated with this thing called Hollywood, right? So that it's a similar kind of concept with Bayt al-Hikmah. So the city of Baghdad itself, so just a brief background. So we have the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who passes away from his worldly life in the year 632. And then we have the Umayyad dynasty. Well, first we have the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the rightly guided caliphs, right? Then we have the Umayyad dynasty, and between those two sets of rulers, it takes us from 632 to 750. And in 750 or 749 to 750, we have this event that occurs that's sort of called the Abbasid revolution, although that's also a problematic term because the word revolution has certain connotations and it didn't exactly play out that way. Point being, the Umayyad dynasty was based in Damascus in what is now Syria. Most of them were either deposed, many of them were killed during this conflict. One member of their family named Abdurrahman managed to escape, and he escaped all the way to Spain or Muslim Al-Andalus, and there he re-established the Umayyad dynasty in Al-Andalus. And then him and his descendants ruled Muslim Spain for many, many generations and had sort of cultural revival happen there as well. But really, the transfer of power went from being in Damascus in Greater Syria, Sham, as it's known in the historical sources, towards the Abbasid stronghold. So the Abbasid dynasty, the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ's uncle Abbas and of his cousin, the famous scholar Harb al-Ummah, the scholar of the Ummah, Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, the Abbasids were their descendants. And their power base was sort of in the Iraq area, more Persianate influence, more of a Persian influence, a Central Asian influence, and less of an Arab influence and the influence of the Arab tribes as the Umayyads had. So the Abbasids' first capital, they moved from Damascus, is to the city of Kufa in Iraq. And then slowly to sort of reestablish their and reinforce their power, as many dynasties and rulers have done throughout history, is to start something from scratch, especially a capital city started from scratch. So that's what Baghdad was. And so they found a convenient location. There's a lot of research done in the process. There was, although it's not an Islamic practice, but there was a lot of astrology involved and that sort of thing. And it was during the time of the Abbasid ruler Al-Mansur in 762 that the city was finished being built, that it was established, the round city. Its actual name initially wasn't Baghdad, it was Madinat al-Salam, right? Or the city of peace. It's really was designed to be a cosmopolitan city. Like Al-Mansur really had a vision for this being a global powerhouse of a city to rival the cities that the Muslims up until that time had only heard about, such as Rome, right, such as Alexandria in ancient times in Egypt, such as the famous capitals of the Persian empires, etc. So this was going to be, in Al-Mansur's mind, the first global cosmopolitan powerhouse of a city for the Muslims. And really it did become that, and his vision was realized. So it's established in the year 762. That's when it sort of has a grand opening, I guess. As you can see the design here, it's right along the Tigris River, and it's well irrigated. A lot of irrigation is set up around it to make sure that this area is sort of, made fertile so that it can actually produce food for the city, for the residents of the city. And the city itself is very well designed and right along the river. And there's this very powerful imagery of marble steps were built going down to the river. So, there's beach, of course, but you could actually walk down these cool and relaxing marble steps all the way down to the banks of the Tigris River. And there's a lot to enjoy in this city. And I think I have an image in the next slide somewhere. So I'm going to come back to the previous one. But here you have a model of the city itself, right? An artist's visualization of what the city might have looked like. A lot of multi-story buildings, of course, as one might expect. The Royal Palace is in the middle. The Grand Mosque of the city is right in the middle. Then there's a lot of gardens. There's a lot of greenery, right? There's a lot of houses of the elite. And then as you move out further to the edges of the city, you get to the more what we might call middle class, or and then certainly the downtrodden and underprivileged people of that society living in multi-story and crowded areas right along the edges. Um, and so you can see that in this conceptualization, it was very meticulously planned, beautifully designed, the best scientific and technological developments that were available and that the Muslims were aware of at the time were put towards developing this city. Now, why do I mention Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam al-Fazari as well? I'll come back to them. Imam Abu Hanifa, as you know, is one of the four major imams, one of the four primary imams of the schools of fiqh, I should say, the schools of Islamic jurisprudence. He's called Imam al-A'zam, the first of those four imams. And Imam Abu Hanifa had a bit of tension, like many of the imams and scholars did, with the rulers. So Al-Mansur and Imam Abu Hanifa didn't necessarily get along very much, and they lived at the same time. So one of the things that Al-Mansur put Imam Abu Hanifa to at one point was when the city was being built, he said, there's two problems that we have, and I'm going to assign them to you. You have to solve them. Right. So he basically, what we call today voluntold, like it's like, oh, I make you volunteer for me kind of situation. He voluntold Imam Abu Hanifa that there's two issues. What were those two issues? The first issue was that this double ringed wall that you can see in this picture here. So there's two walls of the city of Baghdad. The double ringed wall had to be built, and it had to be calculated that how many bricks would be required to complete the wall, and so how much volume of the mud brick material had to be developed, which would then become the bricks for the wall, right? So, and he gave Imam Abu Hanifa this task. And the second task he gave Imam Abu Hanifa was for digging a canal, one of the canals. Remember, I showed you the irrigation system on the map there. One of the canals that was going to come from the Tigris River towards the city, and basically figuring out how to make that happen. Now, it seems what Al-Mansur had in mind was this is sort of a punishment or a distraction for Imam Abu Hanifa, right? It's just to kind of either get his mind on something other than fiqh or something like that, or it might have been actually like, let me punish this person by giving him this task and sort of make him squander his time, because the expectation is, as many of us would expect, it's like, you are an imam of fiqh. How are you going to figure out these very scientific and technological problems? But this was the culture at the time, that there was a love for knowledge and a pursuit of knowledge that was inculcated in people from a very young age. It was the social currency of the time, as I'll mention in a moment. And this is the crux of what the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was all about. So Imam Abu Hanifa was actually able to find solutions to both those problems very effectively, and particularly the way he found a solution to this building of the walls, the amount of material required for the walls. He actually used a specially designed measuring stick, and then did some basically measurements and estimations of the volume of material that would be required to make a certain number of bricks that, based on the height of the wall and the thickness of the wall, would be able to cover basically the entire wall all the way around the city. So this is an imam of fiqh. He's not what you think of when you think of one of the great scientists of the Muslim Ummah, right? So this is kind of a reflection of the culture of the time. And just while we're on this slide, I do have to go one slide back, but Imam al-Fazari is a less known name, but it's the same kind of concept. So Imam al-Fazari is one of the scholars of hadith, one of the transmitters of hadith. He's also one of the prominent writers of the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in fact, there's a record of Imam al-Shafi'i saying that al-Fazari's seerah was one of the best seerah texts that had been written. Now, all that being said, Imam al-Fazari being the student of Imam al-Awza'i and being the student of Imam Malik, right? And being the student of Sufyan al-Thawri. So he's the student of these people. He's the teacher of Imam Ibn al-Mubarak, who in turn is the teacher of Imam Bukhari. So this is his kind of network, right? His own teachers and then his students and his students. It includes people like, the greatest scholars that this ummah has ever known. So you would think, of course, of course, they're hadith scholars and they are scholars of seerah, etc. But this same Imam al-Fazari is the first Muslim person to design an astrolabe and write a book about an astrolabe. He's the first, one of the first people to look at Sanskrit Indian texts on astronomy and translate them into Arabic so they could be used and the Muslims could further develop that knowledge. So many of his writings are about astronomy and about practical applications of astronomical knowledge, right? And designing the astrolabe itself, the astrolabe being this tool that was used to identify the position of the stars in the sky and use that to figure out such things as locations and distances and directions and things of that sort is a very prominent tool in navigation and in cartography and in many other fields. So we have the person who is an excellent writer of seerah. He's a hadith transmitter, is also an astronomer, right? Or developing this knowledge of astronomy, and is also an astrolabe designer and sort of builder. So the knowledge is combined, and this is kind of the spirit. And so many of the stories, and of course we don't have time to go into all of the stories from the city of Baghdad and its surrounding sort of places, but what I'm trying to give you a sense of is that from the very beginning, and we know examples from the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know many hadiths how he emphasized knowledge, right? During the Battle of Khandaq, he did not hesitate to take knowledge from a foreign source. When Salman al-Farisi radiallahu anhu told him that, we dig trenches in Persia when we're facing this kind of conflict, he did not hesitate to take that beneficial knowledge and apply it to his own circumstance. And, they dug that trench in the Battle of Khandaq, the Battle of the Trench as it's known, and defended Medina, right? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu used his knowledge of genealogy, he used his knowledge of Arab lineages to actually give sort of micro-marketing da'wah to particular tribes of Arabs, right? After the Battle of Badr, one of the options for the people who were captives of Quraysh to ransom themselves, to free themselves, was what? If you can teach 10 Muslim children how to read and write, you're free to go, right? Even though the Muslims are in a very difficult position, and what they need, for if you look at it in one sense, in a sort of short-term and immediate priority sense, what they need at the time is money. The Muhajirun, when they left Mecca and went to Medina, their property was confiscated, their property was sold without their permission, and Quraysh took in all that money, and the Muhajirin were, for lack of a better term, even though they were accommodated by the Ansar, they were broke when they came to Medina, right? And so they're in need of money. But what the Prophet ﷺ is saying, at the moment when it's the chance to bring in that money that is fairly, they're able to fairly request, the Prophet ﷺ says, the alternative is also that if you can read 10 Muslim children how to read and write, you are free to go. That's one way to ransom yourself. He's telling the captives. And we have examples from the life of, and the time of Ali radiallahu anhu, when he's using his mathematical knowledge and applying it to Islamic fiqh, right? So this was the culture that was developing. And this is what not me, but sociologists of history, of Islamic history, what they call the culture of learning. And there's a very specific and very detailed, comprehensive discussion of this in journal articles, and there's books written about it and things of that sort. Because there is this question, how did these people go? 762 is not that far away from 632 when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, and now we're in 762. But how did these people go from being sort of a forgotten afterthought and hardly what you would consider a civilization when compared to the civilizations of the Eastern Roman Empire in what is today Turkey and Egypt, or of the Persians, or even of the Ethiopians, etc. Like more civilized cultures around. You had these Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula. What changed, right? What changed? And so it's the culture of learning is this concept that is developed. And what that means is that learning, the production and the sharing and the exchange and the development of knowledge became the social currency of the time. You know, the question at the time, so when we try to imagine it, what does this mean? The question to ask someone really when you met them at the time was, in a sense, what is your contribution to knowledge, right? When we meet someone today, we ask them questions like, oh, and we ask them a range of questions, right? Like when we're trying to get to know someone, where did you study? What did you study? Right? That's one of the questions we ask them. But the other things that we're commonly interested in is whether we ask them or not, but we're trying to find out is, where do you live? What kind of car do you drive? You notice people's clothes, you notice what they're wearing, their social media presence, what do people choose to share about themselves on social media is another good indicator. What kind of food we're eating, the places we're visiting, whether we took pictures with like fall leaves and pumpkins and things of that sort. And I'm not saying any of this stuff is wrong or that it's, I'm not making a comparison of what's better or worse, but I am making a comparison of what kind of culture there was then compared to what kind of culture it is now, for the sake of understanding what we mean by culture of learning. So now all of this is social currency, right? Everything, what you choose to wear, how you choose to present yourself, what you post on social media, it's all our social currency. At the time, the social currency really seems to have revolved around this question of what is your contribution to knowledge? So you had people doing everything from the great scientists and thinkers, the examples that we know, some of them we'll talk about, right? Starting from that to the rulers themselves being so invested in this field of work and so eager to sponsor the leading thinkers and people of knowledge of their time, to the conflicts in society being the most divisive conflicts being about knowledge, right? To people who couldn't directly be involved in knowledge were involved in all sorts of other ways, right? There were paper factories in Baghdad where people worked. It was the first major city in human history with a lot of paper factories, and paper making was knowledge that the Abbasids had picked up most likely through the Battle of Talas in Kazakhstan in the year 750, when it's the only battle really in history when a Muslim force from the Middle East faced off against a Chinese army, right? So it's the Battle of Talas in Kazakhstan, in which there were Chinese prisoners of war, and they were brought, and some of them were brought back to Baghdad. And it's said that through that process, paper making was introduced. And then it spread from Baghdad, starting in Baghdad to Cairo and to Al-Andalus and to other places. But that contribution of cheaply available paper. So you had people contributing that way. You had people who were specialized in making ink. You had people who specialized in translating between different languages. You had people whose only career essentially was to relay knowledge. So there were no microphones. When you had lectures filled with thousands of people, there was one person at the beginning, or sorry, at the stage, I guess, giving the lecture, and then how's everyone else going to hear? There's no microphones and there's thousands of people. So you had people whose career was they would stand at certain intervals and one of the other until it reached all the people at the back, right? And then that's the way the lectures would be held, with thousands and thousands of people passing on knowledge like that. One person would hear it and say and sort of yell it out to the next person, who would yell it out to the next person, and they would then yell it out to the audience in their area where they were standing. So that was a job. That was like a contribution to the culture of learning, right? You had copyists. You had people whose only job and what they did their entire lives was copy from one book. There's no photocopiers, there's no scanners. They're just copying by hand from one book to another. But everyone in some shape or form is trying to establish prestige and develop their social capital and gain their social currency by being involved in this culture of learning, right? And it's not just necessarily things that we would consider like the greatest contributions to knowledge ever, but a lot of those are very significant, and I'll get to that later on. And so this is what the Bayt al-Hikmah was, essentially, right? This is what Bayt al-Hikmah, there's groups of scholars. And by the way, one thing I should point out, in Baghdad and other places, that this was clearly, as I've said, it goes back to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There was a clear Islamic undercurrent of Islamic teachings in this process. There's a very interesting study that's been done, which shows that the trilateral root of Ain, Lam, and Mim, which is Ain, right? Or Alim, or Muallim, or many of these words, the different conjugations of that word. 1% of the vocabulary in the Quran is based on this trilateral root of Ain, Lam, and Mim. And when you think about it, you're like, okay, 1% of the words of the Quran, like, it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about the range of the words in the Quran, and then you think about how many words have you even make it to just 1% of the vocabulary, there's very few words that make it. So it's sort of like a indication of how many times this concept is referred to in the Quran in different forms again and again. And we're all well aware of the Islamic sort of contributions and even the Quranic, the attention that the Quran draws to certain types of knowledge, such as the knowledge of embryology, right? The remarkable description of the development of the embryo in the Quran. So all of that stuff is there, but that being said, it's very important to keep in mind two things. One is that much of this knowledge was originating, like I alluded to earlier, from the pre-Islamic civilizations, right? From the Hindu civilizations in India, from the Buddhist or other faith-grounded civilizations of Central Asia, Zoroastrianism in Iran or Persia, right? And then obviously the ancient Greeks and the Roman knowledge of the Eastern Roman Empire, of the Christians, of the Syriac Christians. There's so many different sources of knowledge that the Muslims are gaining from. And then secondly, as a part of that, so many non-Muslims are involved in the Bayt al-Hikmah, in the House of Wisdom, in so many different roles. So this is truly a cosmopolitan society led by Muslims, guided by this Islamic imperative for people to seek knowledge, but certainly involving and giving an opportunity and making it a very collaborative effort for non-Muslims as well to work with the Muslims to develop knowledge in a way that benefits the Muslim community and benefits society as a whole. So that's one very important thing to keep in mind, because sometimes when I hear discussions about Bayt al-Hikmah, it often does seem like it's used as a chip in us versus them kind of argument. It's like, oh, Muslims did this, and what were Christians doing at the time? It's like, well, no, because it's not that simple. Because yes, Muslims were doing that with Christians in Baghdad and in Cairo, and with Jews and with Hindus and people of many other backgrounds. So it's sort of those kind of immature arguments are completely unnecessary for us to make. Because the production of knowledge is always has to be a collaborative effort, and we have kind of Islamic teachings to this effect that we take wisdom when it's beneficial and it's not problematic. We take it from any source, regardless of where it comes from. So I hope that gives you like a better picture of Bayt al-Hikmah and the culture of learning. And there's more reading that we can all do about this, of course. And then, so let's talk about rulers and some of the thinkers and their contributions. And again, I just want to, instead of going into specific contributions, because that's the stuff that you can get from books, and I'm going to mention like one or two of them, but I don't want to go into too much detail. One reason for that being that I wanted to focus as much as possible on Baghdad. And what's fascinating is that when you think about the greatest Muslim, scientists and thinkers and researchers, not a lot of them were actually based in Baghdad. They certainly benefited from a culture that flowed out of Baghdad into other parts of the Muslim lands, but not many of them made Baghdad their base or their home or anything like that. But anyways, that's the information that you can find fairly easily. And there's so many great books on this topic that are written now. But I want to focus on aspects that, again, we uh, draw our attention back to the culture, because that's what we have to reestablish within our MSAs and within our communities and our masajid and within our society as a whole. It's like, let's develop a culture of learning um, rather than just kind of taking our achievements from the past and constantly reminding ourselves of them. So Al-Ma'mun is a famous Abbasid ruler, and very famous for the difficult life that he lived, the difficult circumstances that he grew up in, his background. He is the son of Harun al-Rashid, the very famous Abbasid ruler from who's famous from the 1001 Nights, and many stories are told about him. And Al-Ma'mun's own curiosity when it comes to the Bayt al-Hikmah, it was his own curiosity and his own kind of almost problematic and unhealthy obsession with knowledge that often got him into difficulty. And the prominent example of that is the Mihna, or the Inquisition, with Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who's also one of the other imams of the school of Hanbali jurisprudence, of course. And that's a story I won't go into the details of, but it was it does give us a sense that Al-Ma'mun had his own firm vision of what it is that the knowledge in an Islamic society should look like, and what everyone's role should be in producing knowledge. And really, he as a person is a microcosm of the Bayt al-Hikmah, both its benefits as well as its problems, right? And so Al-Ma'mun, before he took part in a very kind of dirty conflict and became the caliph, or the ruler, he was the governor of Egypt. And again, he grew up in Baghdad, and he grew up in that culture of learning that had been developed by his father as well, Harun al-Rashid. And when he gets to Egypt and he's the governor there, one of the things he's fascinated by are these pyramids, the great pyramids of Giza as we know them today. And one of the interesting things is that the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or the Great Pyramid of Giza, the big one in the middle, its passageway had never actually been open. Like, there was a place that was clearly a passageway, but nobody was actually able to open it. Like, there's no bombs or something. You can't blast your way inside at the time. But Al-Ma'mun is this famous story about him. He's the governor of Egypt. And one day he brings a whole team and he says, I am going to find out what's on the other side of that door. People are trying to dissuade him, and people are like, you're the governor, you're the prince. I mean, what's going on, right? Why are we doing this? Why are we here in the middle of the desert trying to blast open whatever this thing is? But he is so persistent. And then they continuously try and try and try. It's a very long and interesting, almost a funny story to read. And eventually they're able to, when everyone else has given up, and now it's just this guy knocking himself, trying to find a way, like, maybe we can try this to open it, and maybe we can, crack it open this way and that way. And then finally they managed to open it, right? And to this day, one of the passages that is used, although I believe it's not allowed anymore, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's not allowed anymore to go enter through that passage, but for centuries, the main passage leading into the pyramid was actually broken in by the person who later became the Abbasid ruler in Baghdad, Al-Ma'mun. And on that note, another person from Baghdad was a person named Ibn Wahshiyah, who again played a crucial role in deciphering the hieroglyphs. So, we know that the Rosetta Stone was discovered by Napoleon's army in Egypt, and this was centuries later in the 1800s. But that being said, so many of the hieroglyphs of the ancient Egyptians were deciphered by another person from Baghdad named Ibn Wahshiyah. It's again like the thirst for knowledge, the desire for knowledge, any kind of knowledge. Like, literally, when I look at it, like, you can search up anything. You can, there were Muslims talking about Why does ice float on water? How do people laugh? Like, where does laughter come from? What does laughter mean? What happens to the brain when a person is laughing? Like any possible question you can think of, this is a society where you can find people trying to develop answers, trying to find answers, hotly debating. Ibn Sina and Al-Biruni, two of the greatest minds in history. There's a letter that you can read. It's been translated into English. They're writing letters to each other back and forth, arguing over this question of why does ice float on water? And it's very amusing the way that they're writing about it, right? And of course, they didn't know all of the things that we know today about why ice floats on water, and they were living 1,000 years ago. So there's so many of these examples. The Burmakids are a Buddhist Central Asian kind of family that made its way into Baghdad. And again, once became Baghdad, the culture of learning, right? People were attracted to it from all over. And there's statements like Harun al-Rashid saying that, if somebody produces a book of knowledge on a certain topic, like, they were paid its weight in gold, right? And books at the time were naturally very heavy because paper wasn't very refined. Paper wasn't very thin or anything like that. This is thick paper with those thick threads that are binding the books together. And like you have like a book that's only like 50 pages or something, but it's like this thick, right? And there were much longer books like that. And he's saying that if you bring any book that contributes to knowledge, you put it on the scale, and we'll put gold coins on the other side of the scale and pay you its weight in gold, right? Like a no questions asked kind of policy. So this is the kind of culture that they were trying to develop. And so you have this Buddhist family from Central Asia who comes, and they become the viziers, and they convert to Islam. They become the viziers of Harun al-Rashid and later al-Ma'mun as well. And it's them, not always the rulers directly, but their viziers and the nobles around them, because for everyone, it becomes a thing that I can establish my own prestige if I contribute to the development of knowledge. So every sultan, every emir, every vizier, every noble, every rich merchant, everyone's trying to get in on this industry like somehow, right? Like it's like startups today. Like everyone's trying to like start up something or get involved somehow in the next big thing that's about to happen. And this is what tells us that it's a culture of learning. And the famous story of Al-Ma'mun, before I forget, the Muslims at the time, the Abbasid dynasty, they were constantly at war with the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople. And in one of the wars, when it ended and a peace treaty was signed, and the Abbasids had basically won that conflict, Al-Ma'mun, one of his stipulations was that I will only sign this peace treaty with you if you provide me with a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, right? So Ptolemy had written this famous book of geography called the Almagest, a geography and astronomy. And in a war treaty, Al-Ma'mun is saying the condition for me to sign this war treaty is that there's this one book that we don't have, but we need, called Ptolemy's Almagest, and if you are able to give it to us, we're willing to sign this treaty. So again, on the battlefield from A to Z, and I don't mean to over romanticize this. Of course, society was what it's always been like, right? Many different people. I mean, there's people who are also involved in stealing books, and there's like an underground book trade, and there's all kinds of things, and there's people in all kinds of industries that don't necessarily have to do anything with the production of knowledge, but it is the thing that's talked about. It is the priority for a large, very significant section of the population in Baghdad and in other places. So we have the Burmakids, and then we have the Banu Musa, who were so the Burmakids are viziers, and they're sort of these patrons. They're patronizing so many of the scholars and scientists and thinkers. And you have the Banu Musa, who's a group of three brothers, the sons of a highway robber, actually, named Musa. And his sons all become the most prominent, scientists of their time in Baghdad. And they also become designers. So what they design is automata. So you get this sense when you're reading about them that they were very intelligent, but also had this kind of, leaning towards clownery or getting involved in funny situations and stuff like that. So one of the things they design in the process, just through that creativity, is some of the first automated devices, right? Water clocks and things of that sort, like, machines that work on their own, and continue to work on their own, and produce particular results on their own. So Muslims developed, to give you an example, you know how when we drive around to churches and um, at a certain interval of time, the bell starts to gong automatically, right? So that's one example of automata that actually comes from the Muslim culture. Like Muslims first developed that concept that a clock that ran automatically, when it hit a certain interval of time, it would make a particular noise. The flushing mechanism that we use in our toilets, like there's very complex diagrams of a flushing mechanism where a person who is either making wudu or washing their dishes or doing their laundry or something in this big basin of water, then they pull a lever and all of that water gets drained into a piping system, and a fresh amount of fresh water fills the basin again so they can use it again. So the flushing mechanism, literally the one that we still use to this day in like every toilet in the world, I guess. So these are the kinds of early contributions that the Banu Musa were initiating, and then many others like Al-Jazari and others would sort of follow in their footsteps and develop them much later on. A famous example, of course, nowadays, we know the discussion about algorithms, right? Algorithms this, algorithms that, Facebook algorithms and artificial intelligence and, this and that. The word algorithm is just a Latinized form of the name of Al-Khwarizmi. And of course, as we know, he is the father of algebra. He wrote a book called the Kitab al-Jabr, right? And that's where the word algebra comes from. It has a longer name. That's the shortened name of the book in Arabic. Very, very prominent mathematician, obviously drawing on particularly the knowledge of the pre-Islamic Indian Hindu civilization and the incredible work, to be honest, that they had done in the fields of astronomy and mathematics, and drawing upon that and developing it further into the first sort of systemized form of algebra as we know it today, as well as introducing the concept of the zero, right? The number zero. I don't know if it's technically correct to say that. I never did great at math, but anyways, you guys probably know, some of you better than I do. So let me know. But and to astronomy as well. So contributions to mathematics and contributions to astronomy. And he's one of those rare examples of the great Muslim thinker that actually lived and passed away in Baghdad, right? And very early on as well, of course. And there's really not enough you can say about this person. He contributed to so many other fields, so many fields of knowledge, and there's just this curiosity that he seems to have had. And a very practical approach as well, always oriented towards finding solutions that will benefit the Muslim community, things such as finding the direction of the Kaaba. And he did a lot of work in astronomy as well in that direction, mapping the stars and that sort of work. So definitely a person of the Baghdad, Bayt al-Hikmah kind of environment that we should all learn more about. And especially, I always joke around with my friends, like whenever they're using the word algorithm, I'll say I'll say the same thing. I'll be in part of that discussion, but I'll keep saying al-Khwarizmi, right? Until whether they're Muslim or not, until somebody like kind of gets confused and asks why, just so I can put this in there that this is where the word comes from. And now I want to go like just a bit in a different direction. So I know we have the Bayt al-Hikmah, right? And I know there's many famous scientists and many famous thinkers and their contributions and how they transformed civilization through those contributions, etc. I think one thing we often don't talk about enough as Muslims is Muslim contributions to culture. Science and technology are a subcategory of culture, right? And Muslims have contributed so much to culture as it's enjoyed around the world. It is phenomenal, and so much of it goes back again to this Bayt al-Hikmah environment. Now, why is this important? I just want to, clarify this. When we try to share, and I feel like this is like, we can be honest with ourselves. This is often the purpose why we ourselves want to know about what Muslims contributed to different fields, because we want to share it with others, right? And especially at the university environment, we should be interrupters, right? We should be, when like, okay, we went through high school, sure, nobody mentioned anything about Muslim contributions. We are in university, the last stage of learning, formal learning in many people's lives, and we are in, you know, specific classrooms at the undergrad or the graduate level on discussing specific topics. And if you're going to talk about the history of a you know, concept or a field that Muslims significantly contributed to, and you're a prof or something, and you are not even going to mention, like, you know, you're going to talk about the history of math and never mention al-Khwarizmi, then now it's my time to interrupt you, right? So that's one thing. But when it's society in general, it's kind of weird, the kind of approach that I've seen, and I've done it myself as well, but the approach that we take, right? Like, imagine this, you are standing at a Tim Hortons and you are having a conversation with, I don't know, the person in line in front of you or something like that. And both of you are holding the cup of coffee, right? And now you're having this conversation about it, somehow comes up. And I feel like that's the moment when a lot of us are inclined to go like, we're having a great conversation about like Islamic history with this person. Oh, did you know that Muslims invented algebra, right? And to me, it's like, that is great. At the same time, I think we might be missing an opportunity. Why? Because when we're talking to society as a whole, you know, things like algebra, Muslims invented, you know, algebra, Muslims sort of contributed to the first prototype of a flushing mechanism, which is used in your toilets. Muslims created the camera obscura. Ibn al-Haytham in Egypt created the camera obscura. Every camera in the world, including the camera in every smartphone in the world, every DSLR in the world, all of those go back to the original concept of a Muslim scientist in Egypt named Ibn al-Haytham, who created the first camera obscura, right? That being said, we are often bringing in very technical conversations to everyday life. And the question that I sort of get in my mind is that at that moment, I should probably, you know what I should say to that person is, look, both of us are holding a coffee cup. If you look at the bottom of this coffee cup, there's a, right beneath the Tim Hortons logo, it says 100% Arabica. 100% Arabica. What does that mean? Like, have you ever thought about that? Right? Like, we need to diversify our own vision of what Muslims have contributed to the world so that we can point out to them that Muslims have contributed to every aspect of your life. And this goes back to the concept of Bayt al-Hikmah in Baghdad. Every aspect of life. Who gave tulips to the Western world, to Europe? It was tulips started in Persia, made their way to the Ottoman Empire, went to Europe, came to Canada. Now it's like it's the thing you give to like your significant other to express your affection or something like that, right? Who gave you the coffee that you drink every morning? Who gave you the first novel, right? The first novel ever was written by a Muslim. Like, the examples just are one after another, right? The story of Tarzan, the story of Mowgli, like Robinson Crusoe, the first novel written in English, all go back to that first novel written in Spain by Ibn al-Tufayl, right? And the example just come one after another. There's two lines in the American national anthem that are based on the Congreve rocket that the Canadian and British forces were using against the Americans in the War of 1812. And that Congreve rocket was essentially an idea that was stolen from the last independent Muslim empire in India, the empire of Tipu Sultan, who had created that rocket. It was taken by the British, brought to the West, used in the War of 1812. There's two lines in the American national anthem about it, right? Used by the Canadian forces, and then eventually became the basis for the design of the rockets that have taken, people and satellites into outer space, all able to trace their way back to that Tipu Sultan of Mysore, the last Muslim, ruler of independent Muslim ruler of India. So there is example after example. There's Edgar Allan Poe, one of the greatest poets in American history, right? You must, like, at some point in high school, you must have heard this name, or if you're studying English literature or something, search it up. When he was like 16, he wrote one of his longest poems. And of course, he was 16, so one of his first poems. And the title of that poem literally is Al-Araf. Like he literally named a poem at the age of 16 after a surah of the Quran. And the actual topic of that poem is Al-Araf, like the heights, right? The concept that the Quran describes is what's being discussed in that. Um, So, I'm just giving you one example after another. There are countless examples, but what I want to do is emphasize how important it is to broaden our horizon. So I'm going to go back to these two stories again from Baghdad. Buran was the wife of Al-Ma'mun, the person we mentioned earlier, one of the wives of Al-Ma'mun. And at the time, eggplants were a plant that was known to the people, but they weren't very well appreciated. Their doctors said that eggplants, they cause freckles and they cause cancer, and everyone said like they taste horrible and there's no way to cook them and they make you sick to your stomach and things of that sort. So what Al-Buran did is she started experimenting in the kitchen. And by the way, it wasn't just her, it's not just that women were experimenting in the kitchen. One of the Abbasid princes, Ibrahim al-Mahdi, was also known at the same time to do a lot of kitchen experiments and try to develop new foods in the kitchen, right? And again, it's that spirit of creativity. So Al-Buran came up with this process where she would cut up the eggplant and she would soak it in salt water for a while. And then she would take it out from salt water, and the salt water would sort of take away some of its bitterness. And then she would fry it in sesame seed oil. And then she would add it to different meals, right? And again, this is in the this is in the 700s actually. Now, Al-Buran, her recipes transformed really what the world today knows about eggplants and eating them. It's not even like an exaggeration, right? One woman's creativity and her spirit to not just take, okay, yeah, of course, nobody likes eggplants, but no, we're going to try something different. Like this is knowledge, and we really have to expand our horizons about what we consider knowledge and what we consider Muslim contributions. That's the point I'm making here, right? To this day, even in Britain, it's only in Canada and the United States that it's called eggplant, but even in this day in Britain, it's called aubergines, right? It's called aubergines, like, and in Spanish, in Portuguese, right? It's just different versions of her name. That BRN, that ba, ra, and noon combination has found its way into so many of the world's languages, to the point that in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, they've completely lost the context. But in the Caribbean and parts of the Caribbean, eggplant is called brown jolly. It's called brown jolly. Again, it went from brania in Morocco. Then it became brinjale in one of the European languages. It was brought to the West Indies. It became known as brown jolly, right? And to this day, it's you can have borani in Afghanistan. You can have borani in Turkey, the Turkish version. You can have barania in Morocco, right? And in different parts of the world, you're constantly, if you find an eggplant dish, it's still named somehow after this woman, Buran, right? And literally there's studies of how the poetry about eggplants changed, how eggplants became, after her experiments and developing this food into something that people enjoyed eating, the doctor's perspectives changed on what the eggplant did health-wise. The poets' perspectives changed on how they started to describe eggplants. A similar story with oranges. Oranges are native to India, right? Naranj is the bitter orange, is native to India, where the word orange comes from. And once the Muslim rulers, they reached India and they discovered this fruit, Al-Qahir, one of the later Abbasid rulers, he made an effort to bring it, right? And they started planting them in Oman, and really they found so many fruits in India that they had to change the cultivation culture. And again, this is one of the forgotten contributions of the Muslims. If you look it up, there's something called the Islamic Agricultural Revolution, a revolution that transformed the agriculture of the Middle East and North Africa and Spain, and took fruits that could only be grown in India all the way across to the point that they were grown in West Africa and in Spain and in North Africa and many other parts of the Muslim land. And orange is one example. right? So the oranges started to be grown in Oman. And then from there, there was a famous garden in Baghdad during the time of Al-Qahir. And he describes them as like orbs hanging in the heavens. And there's a description of, because orange trees are known to be very beautiful, to look very beautiful, right? And they started planting orange trees, and then orange tree twigs became known as particularly special miswaks. Like the best miswaks or some of the greatest miswaks were said to come from orange trees. Some of the greatest furniture was said to be made from the wood of the orange tree, right? Oranges were used as condiments, etc. And then it continues to go all the way across until it goes into Europe. And then Europeans later on, they find the sweet orange, or what we would typically think of as the orange, right? And then they bring it to the West. And now we know like they're planted in like parts of the United States and stuff like that. And just a quick story. I know I'm like already over time here probably, but I'm just going to wrap up very quickly. So this is a contribution, right? This is something that, we should think when we see orange juice at like No Frills or something like that, right? Like it should be coming to mind when you see an eggplant, right? Like this is part of our heritage, not just like Al-Khwarizmi's algebra, and all of those things are extremely important. But when we want to start sharing our cultural contributions with the world, when we want the world to appreciate them, when we want the world to appreciate what Muslims bring to the table when it comes to human progress and human civilizational development, we're going to need more examples than just algebra and even things that people like may not necessarily be too interested in. Like if I take the example of like the famous father of chemistry, Jabir ibn Hayyan, and go into chemistry, like you'll have me bored within 5 minutes, forget someone who's not even into Islamic history, right? But when it comes to more like everyday kind of examples, that's where you really get people's attention. Coffee is great, eggplant is great, oranges are great. Any kind of food actually is great because food is something we all experience at such an intimate and personal level. And just to give you one more quick example, while we're on the story of oranges, one of the first Muslim settlers in Canada's far north, his name was Peter Baker. His actual name was Ahmad Ali Farran. He was a Lebanese Canadian, came to Canada very early in the 1900s. In the 1920s, early 1920s, he actually took some oranges and he took orange flavored syrup to a festival that indigenous people were having in what is now the Northwest Territories. Early 1920s, so a century ago, right? So he goes to this Fort Resolution area in what's now the Northwest Territories. The indigenous people are having a festival there, and he's one of the first people to actually bring them oranges. And he starts selling oranges at that festival and starts selling that orange flavored syrup or that orange juice. And really, it's said that for the rest of his life, essentially, all of the indigenous people in that area, literally in their language, they named him Orange. So he was called Orange across the Northwest Territories, right? This early Muslim Lebanese trader who took oranges and orange flavored syrup to them. So the contributions continue, even the technological contributions. We don't have to go all the way back to Baghdad. It's more about, the question is not what happened in Baghdad specifically, but what is the legacy of what happened in Baghdad to this day, right? Only a few decades ago, the person who designed the Sears Tower in Chicago, the Willis Tower as it's now known, was a Muslim, a Bengali Muslim, right? Bengali American Muslim, Fazlur Rahman Khan. He's considered the Einstein of structural engineering. He's called the father of CAD, of computer assisted design, right? Every skyscraper that's been built in the world really in the past 50 years, including the Trump Towers, including Burj Khalifa, including buildings all over the world, has relied on the concepts of structural engineering that were developed by this Muslim, Fazlur Rahman Khan. And this wasn't centuries ago in Baghdad. This was just, a few decades ago in Chicago. But he was embodying the spirit of the Bayt al-Hikmah. He was embodying what was the spirit of contributing that the Bayt al-Hikmah and that early culture of learning sort of gave us. Now, why is that important? Because for many people, the narrative ends of Bayt al-Hikmah of Baghdad in the year 1258 when the Mongols, they sacked the city of Baghdad, right, the Mongol army really destroyed and razed to the ground the city of Baghdad. And we get all of these descriptions. And one of the first things that we'll find people always saying is that the river, the Tigris River turned black with ink from the books and stuff like that. Like, we internalize that concept and internalize that metaphor that in 1258, the production of knowledge in Baghdad came to an end and the Beit al-Hikmah was like done and it was over with, right? And I think that is very problematic. And I alluded to this at the beginning of the presentation. I think that contributions continued in different fields, in different ways, in different places. And it's actually us who don't have the full picture because we focus on one part of the picture. Maybe it's the center of the picture and the center was destroyed. But by that time, the legacy of what had happened in Baghdad, of the Beit al-Hikmah, had spread so far. It had spread so far to everywhere that the Muslims had gone, that that spirit of contributing has lasted right up until this very day. And I think we need to really not stop our story at 1258 and bring it right up to 2020 and figure out everything that's happened in between, learn about what happened from the beginning as well, right up to the present day, that this isn't something that can be taken away from us. This spirit isn't something that can be taken away from us just because, oh, there's a Mongol invasion, or there's Islamophobia, or there's wars in the Middle East, or this or that is happening. No, it's a spirit that goes right back to the essence of the teachings of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the example of the Sahaba and the early giants and scholars of our ummah, right? It goes back to the heart of what the Quran, the kind of worldview it is creating in our minds. And we can't sort of be detached from it. We really can't be detached from it. We can fall short, we can slow down, but the process actually never stops. It has continued. And if we look broadly at what Muslims contribute to society, they have always contributed, never stopped contributing, and they're still contributing it to this day. And we need to take in all of that as inspiration to make noise about those contributions, interrupt when those contributions should be discussed and they're not, and take those contributions as inspiration for ourselves to go above and beyond in whatever field we're working in, to make our contributions that future generations of Muslims will find inspiration in and benefit from. So Jazakallah khair for listening to all that. And I hope it's beneficial. I hope it's some good food for thought. And I know I didn't go into specific examples of, who did what in the Beit al-Hikmah, etc. And I really wanted to get this message across, but I can recommend some reading resources and other things that you can go to for further details, for specific examples. But I wanted to focus more on the legacy of the city of Baghdad and the Beit al-Hikmah. So Jazakallah khair, everyone, for listening.
Jazakallah khair for the very interesting lecture, and to everyone else for attending. It seems that there are no questions, so that's all for today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Guys, wait, don't leave so quickly. I mean, I totally forgot to do the feedback form. So why don't you guys just, message the UTM MSA Instagram and let us know how was the lecture. Yes, please, I need the feedback form. So like any feedback at all. Just drop a liner or something. And yep. It was very nice to see all of you guys. Hamza, yeah, it's nice to see you again. And Brother Mason, Aditi, Miguel. I hope I said it properly. Then Muhammad Junaid, although you go by Junaid. And Noor, assalamu alaikum. So I was quiet the whole time, but you guys get to hear me now. Okay, bye-bye. Salam. Wa alaikum assalam.